I'm Adam, a climate scientist with a PhD from Oxford, sharing what you need to know about climate change. And today I want to talk about the leader of the United States of America, Elon Musk. Sorry, that was needlessly trolly. But however you look at it, Elon Musk, who hasn't been elected in any way, shape, or form, has played a crucial role in Donald Trump's presidency, from backing his re-election to enacting devastating cuts. Now, of course, there's a huge amount that can and has been said about Elon Musk, from his business practices to his personal life, to his repeating of fascist talking points, to his backing up of fascist leaders, and his making hand gestures, which of course have nothing to do with fascism. But despite all of that, I've been made aware that there are some people that still think Elon Musk cares about the climate, which is, the thing that actually made him famous in the first place. Well, apart from dating Grimes and slapping an X on Twitter. Oh, and that reminds me, I'm actually on Blue Sky now, link in the description. So today I'd like to take a look at what Elon Musk actually says when it comes to climate change. I'm not going to talk so much about his specific actions and really let his words speak for themselves. And we'll take a look at how accurate these words are and how his positions have changed over the years. Okay, so this has been more than enough of a preamble. Let's actually start off looking at some clips. And to kick us off, we've got a clip from almost a full decade ago when Elon Musk gave a talk at Sorbonne in France. This was during the Paris climate talks, which led to the Paris Climate Agreement. And mostly what he says in this talk is really pretty sensible. Like when he's talking about global temperature changes and he says,
small changes result in huge effects.
Which is absolutely true. So we talk about limiting global warming under 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. And these numbers sound really tiny. Actually, these changes have absolutely huge effects in terms of increasing extreme weather events, spread of diseases, sea level rise. So spot on from Musk there. He then goes on to talk about what the goal of fighting climate change ultimately is.
The goal is to exit the era as quickly as possible.
Which is absolutely the correct top-line goal. It's not a very interesting thing to say, it's so obvious, except when we contrast it with what he says later on, so spoiler alert. Okay, and then later in the talk, Elon Musk talks about how climate change could impact us.
The worst case is more displacement and destruction than all the wars in history combined. About 3% of scientists that believe in the best case, about 97% that believe in the worst case.
So this is really interesting. So the first thing he says is that climate change could cause this huge amount of devastation and destruction. That's a really, really hard thing to quantify. That should set off alarm bells when he says 97% of climate scientists think that thing. And what he's actually doing is taking a statistic which is, at the time, around 97% of climate scientists agreed that global warming was happening and being caused by humans, and then translating it to something completely different, the impacts of climate change. So, in other words, completely misrepresenting that statistic. He's willing to distort evidence in order to promote his cause. So I found that really interesting, looking way back almost a decade ago. Let's step forward to 2018. This was his first appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast.
So why run this crazy experiment where we take trillions of tons of carbon from underground and put it in the atmosphere and oceans? It's the dumbest experiment in human history.
Now, I think that's really spot on, and that's a framing that I hear a lot of climate scientists use as well. We're pushing our planet into uncharted territory. This effectively is a massive unplanned experiment where we're just around and finding out when we pump so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that it's at higher levels than it's been for millions of years. And really cool to see him bring that up on Joe Rogan. He then goes on to say,
if we put too much carbon in the atmosphere, things overheat, oceans warm up, ocean real estate becomes a lot less valuable. Something's underwater.
I think that's a really decent description of a lot of the consequences we can expect to see from heating the planet up. And again, it wouldn't be interesting if it weren't for what's going to come later in this video. So watch this space. And now jumping forward a bit to 2022. So this is suddenly a lot more recent. We're now in an era where Elon Musk is starting to temper what he's saying. So instead of straightforwardly arguing that we need to fight climate change and it's really urgent, he starts saying stuff like this.
I am not one of the doomsday people, which may surprise I actually think we're on a good path. As long as we have a high sense of urgency about moving towards a sustainable energy economy, then I think things will be fine.
What really frustrates me about videos like this, well, there are two things. The first thing is what Elon Musk's talking about, what he's claiming, flies in the face of all the evidence we have, which is that the current trajectory we are on is nowhere near enough to limit global warming to what would be relatively safe levels. We are on our current trajectory heading for more like 3 degrees Celsius, which would be absolutely devastating for the planet and for all the people that live on it. So what he's saying is completely in contradiction with everything we understand about climate change. So that's number one, what frustrates me about this video. Number two is that you have very serious interviewers. Here, this interviewer is, I believe, the head of TED Talks, who are just like, oh yes, how interesting, you're so wise. Even though the thing that is being said to them is in contradiction with literally all the evidence. And by just sitting there and silently nodding, they add a real legitimacy to what otherwise are complete bonkers claims. And they should at the very least say, well, that's interesting in how much it disagrees with everything I've heard. Can you provide one iota of evidence for that? But unfortunately, that is never how these interviews go. One place where Elon Musk thankfully at least used to be challenged a lot more was on Twitter. And here's a tweet from the following year. So this is from 2023. He says, "It's important to note that what happens on Earth's surface, for example, farming, has no meaningful impact on climate change." Absolutely not true. There are loads of ways, and we'll discuss these a bit more in a moment, loads of ways that what happens on Earth's surface can impact the climate. For example, we can destroy forests, releasing a whole bunch of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. When we talk about what causes climate change, there's an entire category we use effectively for what happens on Earth's surface. We climate scientists call that land use change. It seems to be when he's started to try and play into the rhetoric of farmers' protests, which have really been pounced on by far-right groups as a way of denouncing more mainstream politics. Moving on to the last part of this tweet, he says, over time, if we keep doing this, releasing greenhouse gases, the chemical makeup of our atmosphere will change enough to induce meaningful climate change. This over time is doing a lot of work misleading in this sentence because we are already feeling the impacts of climate change today. People are already dying of extreme heat today. We're seeing extreme weather events around the world made tens, hundreds, even thousands of times more likely because of climate change. Sea level rise is already affecting communities across the globe. The idea that climate change is tomorrow's problem and that we might eventually see the impacts of it flies in the face of, well, it flies in the face of the things we are already seeing today. So I think this tweet actually was a bit of a wake-up moment for a lot of people where it's like, okay, Elon Musk is beginning to talk some nonsense when it comes to climate change. And here's an interview also from 2023, and this time it's at the New York Times Book Summit.
Tesla has done more to help the environment than all other companies combined. Therefore, as a leader of the company, I've done more for the environment than any single human on Earth.
Again, another very serious interviewer who doesn't ask any questions to follow up on absolutely bonkers claims like this one is. Now, I happen to believe that Tesla did perform a really fantastic role in popularizing the electric car. Now, granted, Elon Musk has undone a lot of that popularity, but I do think that's been an extremely important role. What I find wild, though, is the way he talks about himself there. So in my work, I work a lot as a science journalist. I have interviewed literally hundreds of discipline-leading scientists from all different disciplines over the years, including several, at least 3 Nobel laureates. And none of these people talk about themselves in this kind of way. People who tend to achieve really great things in their field tend to understand what they've achieved within a wider context and understand the importance of being a part of a much bigger system and understand that their contribution, while significant, is just one contribution of many. I think it speaks a lot for who Elon Musk is, that he's making the claim that he is the most important person on the planet for the environment. The next year, in 2024, we're catching up with the present day now, Elon Musk went back on the Joe Rogan Experience, and we can see what he talked with Joe Rogan about there.
There's a
Yeah.
lot of propagandists that put this thing out there that animal agriculture is the #1 contributor to global warming.
Yeah, it's rubbish. It's
bullshit.
not true. Bullshit. It's not going to make any difference if people eat fewer steaks. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. Irrelevant. I want to just be super clear about that.
Well, he's definitely been super clear about that. He's also been super wrong about that. Farming as a whole is responsible for up to a third of all emissions. And absolutely, meat and dairy, especially red meat and dairy, are responsible for a disproportionate amount of emissions. So gram for gram, beef produces around 60 times more emissions than peas do, just for an example. And our consumption of animal products like meat, dairy, eggs, things like that, are potentially enough on their own to make it impossible to limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. So far from being irrelevant, they're potentially enough to make us overshoot these crucial heating limits. So why does Elon Musk then say that they're absolutely irrelevant?
And if somebody says it does make a difference, I'm like, how will you measure it? And if you can't even measure it, then it's bullshit.
Again, it's one of these things which sounds entirely sensible until you actually think about it and realize that there are loads of different ways that you can measure it. Environmental impacts of food can come from a host of different things. We already mentioned land use changes. Then there's things like transport. There's the emissions on the farm. So that could be like the feed for the animals or the methane that cattle burp out. So you can divide up the emissions of food into lots of different categories, and then you can measure those emissions. So far from it being impossible to be measured, it's something that absolutely is measured, and that's how we know it exists. Okay, so that's enough clips for a moment. I just want to take a little break and just read some tweets, because I feel like that will be relatively calming. And we're starting off with one from 2024. This one sounds really upbeat and really lovely. Climate change is tracking to be solved. Except we've already discussed how that absolutely isn't the case. In order to solve climate change, we need to get to net zero overall, so overall zero emissions of carbon dioxide. And while there's definitely been some progress, emissions are still actually going up when they need to be falling fast. So I don't know what track Elon Musk is looking at, but climate change is not tracking to be solved. And then we get a couple of tweets which kind of say the same things as each other, which are him claiming that climate change couldn't have had a role in the wildfires that California is seeing, and claiming that climate change is happening, but slowly, as he puts it in one tweet. And in another, he says, climate change risk is real, just much slower than alarmists claim. Firstly, we know that climate change absolutely does play a role in fires like the fires we've seen around Los Angeles. In fact, scientists have studied that specific fire to show that climate change made it substantially more likely. Climate change isn't causing these fires, but is causing them to be worse and more likely than they otherwise would have been. That's point number one. Point number two is whether climate change is not as bad as the alarmists made out. So far from it being a case where the more we've learned about it, the more we've realized actually it's going to be fine. The more we've learned about it, the more serious we understand it to be, and the more seriously, urgently, we need to act to tackle it. Okay, so that's enough of our little tweet interlude. We're now going to go to our last bunch of clips, which are taken from a conversation between Elon Musk and Donald Trump in the run-up to the 2024 election.
That I don't think we should vilify the oil and gas industry and the people that have worked very hard in those industries to provide the necessary energy to support the economy.
I would agree with this if it were the case that people in fossil fuel industries acknowledge that the economy needs to change and they need to work to shift their business model to adapt for a changing climate, which is the exact opposite of what they've done. They've actively fought progress to stop climate change through campaigns of misinformation, through lobbying, etc., etc., etc. And you don't need to take my word for it. You can listen to the words of Elon Musk himself, who said, Tesla is affecting powerful vested interests. Big auto and oil companies aren't known for their gentle behavior, which is absolutely right, and why a lot of people are very cynical about oil and gas companies. On this point, Elon Musk goes on to say,
and if we were to stop using oil and gas right now, we would all be starving and the economy would collapse.
Which is true, but also nonsense. So if we stopped burning oil, coal and gas overnight, yeah, that would really screw things up. It's lucky then that literally no one is calling for us to do this. That's why we talk about it as an energy transition, not an energy switch. So this is what we would call a straw man argument, denouncing an argument that actually no one makes in the first place. So at this point, having initially a few years ago really been talking about how serious climate change is, how urgently we need to act on it, Musk is now just pushing straightforward climate denial talking points.
We do over time want to move to a sustainable energy economy. There is some risk. I think the risk is not as high as a lot of people say it is with respect to global warming.
So again, he's taking this position where he's saying, yeah, we should transition, but we can do it slowly. Sure, there's some risk, but it's less risk than a lot of people claim. And providing absolutely zero evidence for either of these claims, both of which stand in stark contrast to all the evidence we have. The first being that if we're going to limit global warming to relatively safe levels, we need to be transitioning the global economy, global society, as quickly as we possibly can. He then says, oh, I think there might be some risk, but it's not nearly as much risk as people claim, without giving any specifics. He's not saying what claims he's denouncing or what levels of risk he doesn't believe in. But as I say, the more we've come to understand climate change, the more severe we understand the risks of climate change to be. Now, this next clip I found absolutely infuriating when I first heard it. Let's see if I have the same reaction today. He's talking about carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and what the risk of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is.
If you just keep increasing the parts per million in the atmosphere long enough, eventually it actually simply gets uncomfortable to breathe. We still have quite a bit of time, so there's not like we don't need to rush.
So this is such a logical misstep. Yeah, no, it does still infuriate me a huge amount. So absolutely, it's true. If we increase carbon dioxide levels really high in the atmosphere, then we start having direct health impacts just from breathing in air with that much carbon dioxide in it. And as he says, we're not particularly close to that happening. But then he uses this as an argument to say that we don't need to rush to stop emitting carbon dioxide, which is a huge non sequitur because, of course, the main reasons we want to stop emitting carbon dioxide aren't to do with it affecting the air we breathe and our cognitive functions, but to do with shifts to the climate, to do with extreme weather events, to do with us being able to grow enough food. So it's such a hugely dishonest piece of logic. Okay, so very final clip, and this is from the same interview, but it's something Donald Trump said, and I find it interesting. Well, let's just hear what Donald Trump has to say.
You know, the biggest threat is not global warming, where the ocean's going to rise 1/8 of an inch over the next 400 years, and you'll have more oceanfront property, right?
Firstly, just complete made-up statistic. Global oceans have already raised far more than 1/8 of an inch thanks to climate change, and are projected to rise somewhere between 1 meter and 2 meters in the worst-case scenarios by the end of this century. So firstly, completely made-up statistic. And then Trump goes on to say, and this will be great, sea level rise will be great because we'll have more oceanfront property. Now, I find this really interesting because Elon Musk is just sitting there listening to this absolute nonsense and he doesn't say anything. Even though, if you remember in one of our very first clips, Elon Musk said this.
Ocean real estate becomes a lot less valuable.
So we know that Elon Musk knows that this is nonsense, but we can see that he has no interest in challenging it in any way, shape, or form. And we can just see how much Elon Musk's relationship with climate change information has changed over the past 10 years. Okay, so look, where does this leave us? The reality is that at this point, the mask has well and truly slipped, and it's become clear that Elon Musk isn't meaningfully interested in working to stop climate change. In fact, he's actively promoting decades-old climate disinformation, despite it being clear that this was not his position just a few years ago. It's also striking that a full decade ago, he was also sharing misinformation. Just then, it was the other way around. In other words, when Elon Musk talks about alarmists making climate change seem way worse than it actually is, it's unclear who he could be talking about, except perhaps Elon Musk. And look, it's unclear whether Musk believes what he's saying or whether he just knows enough people listening will believe what he's saying. Either way, it seems like his priority is promoting himself and his profit rather than protecting the planet. And this brings me to the final point that I'd like to make, which is, do his words even matter? Like, if Musk was actually accurate when he spoke about climate change, would that be enough to make him a climate leader we would want to follow? You see, solving climate change requires a major transition, not just for our cars, but for our economies, for our cities, for our societies. And we have to ask ourselves, whose vision of that transition, whose vision of that future we actually want to live in? And to answer that, we can ask who is creating a world we feel happy to live in the present. Now, people are always asking me what they can do to carve out the world that they want to live in the future, and whether protesting could make any difference. And, well, here's my answer. Okay, until next time. Bye.
Yogurt